También me disculparé por mi español, que es tan oxidado que no puedo hablarle. Así que voy a resumir brevemente mi discurso para ustedes. Lo que me gustaría mostrar es que en el contexto de la militancia ultra protestante y anticatólica en el Reino Unido a finales del siglo XIX y principios del XX, la memoria de la intolerancia fue movilizada por los activistas para generar apoyo popular. La memoria, pero también la historia, y utilizaron la historia como argumento para mostrar con mayor profundidad lo profundamente intolerante que era el catolicismo. Su objetivo era, por tanto, frenar la tolerancia estatal que se había establecido desde principios del siglo XIX hacia los católicos. Sus acciones no tuvieron éxito, pero lo que me interesa aquí es más el síntoma, es decir, sus manifestaciones como síntoma de una voluntad de demostrar lo que era la identidad nacional y no finalmente como una acción efectiva. Gracias. Now I will switch to English, which I'm more familiar with. And I'd like to start this presentation with a quote that you can see on the PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to read it with you very briefly. This is taken from a pamphlet, a very short text, which was edited by an ultra-Protestant society association of the late 19th century in Britain. So I'll read it with you. Ritualists and Romanists are again endeavoring to mislead our fellow countrymen and take them back to the dark ages preceding the glorious Reformation. The Protestant onward movement seeks, by the free distribution of Protestant literature, to educate the people in the principles of Protestantism. Already a Protestant revival is setting in over the country. Cromwell isn't dead. Okay, so what's interesting here and what you can start to see is, of course, the balance, the contrast between the Dark Ages, the so-called Catholic Dark Ages, and of course, the modernity of Cromwell and then the Glorious Revolution in the 17th century. Cromwell was celebrated here as a champion of Puritan Protestantism. Now, what interests me here is that notions of Protestant revivals, Protestant crusade, the word was pronounced this morning. So Protestant crusade, against Catholics. Those notions were revived, they were resuscitated in the later part of 19th century Britain, not only in Britain, but also in its colonies. So if you think of Australia, Canada, South Africa, and I'm forgetting one, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and that's enough for now. Okay, sorry. So what is of interest to me is that in this particular, the later part of the 19th century, a series and numbers of ultra-Protestant clubs and associations were revived or were created, and they associated under an umbrella organization. You have the name here, the Imperial Protestant Federation, and you have a picture of its founder, Walter Walsh. Walter Walsh was an Anglican, so he was a Protestant, he was an Anglican, but all the societies which were associated with this Imperial Federation, they were all obviously Protestant societies, but they were all evangelical. They adhered to evangelical principles, whatever their denomination. So what I'd like to explore with you this morning is how memories, I think the word is the same in Spanish, memorias, whereas in French we would say la mémoire or the souvenirs also. So how memories, as well as the history of religious violence, and in our case of Catholic violence, how those memories and the history were mobilized to resist the so-called progress of Roman Catholicism in 19th century Britain. And I would like to start out by distinguishing between memory and history here with a very, very simple definition. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just to start out things clearly. So whereas history is situated outside the event, and history is supposed to generate a critical approach conducted from the outside, memory places itself within the event, reassembling it, as it were, by traveling inside the subject. So what is interesting here, and this is what I'm going to start with, is that both memories and history, so if you prefer subjective memories and a so-called objective history, were mobilized in an anti-Catholic hate speech in 19th century Britain. So I'll start and I'll look at memory, and then I'll look at history, the way that history was utilized by anti-Catholics. And this morning, Vaughan showed this in the Belgian case. And I'd like to end with a third question that Javier addressed also in his introduction and presentation of the conference. How effective, because the issue also for historians is what were the effects of this anti-Catholic discourse? Did this anti-Catholic discourse succeed? Was it successful in fighting against growing state toleration? So how effective? And we'll examine this together. So I'll start with the reactivation of the memories of intolerance, which was key, which was central within the anti-Catholic strategy. So what was sought, what was looked at for by the anti-Catholics in this reviving of memories was to recreate closeness and proximity towards past events. And this was done sometimes by physical demonstrations. I'm going to give you examples in a minute. And of course, physical demonstrations had the possible side effect of exciting pure indignation and feelings of revenge. Okay, so I'll start with something that you're all familiar with, and Valentine Zuber this morning insisted on this. Valentine reminded us that in the 19th century was a time where statues were erected, where monuments were erected to commemorate people and events. And this is a picture taken from a memorial for Protestant martyrs. So those martyrs were the martyrs who were burned as heretics during the reigns of Henry VIII and then Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary in Protestant memory. So you have an example there. So again, there is no representations. It's simply a memorial with names. And apologies, I don't have any closer picture. And why I'm showing you this, because this was part of a global movement in the later 19th century, whereby that kind of memorial, the type of memorial, was built and erected in different parts, especially of southern England, in the south of England. And the idea was to honor the men and the women, the heroes, the martyrs of the post-Reformation period. So that's the first example of the utilization, the use of memory in anti-Catholic strategy. Second type of reviving the memories was reviving the memories in print, in books, pamphlets, leaflets, etc. And I'd like to quote here an extremely successful book, actually by John Fox. It was first published in the 16th century. The first edition went back to the immediate post-Reformation era. You can see the date, 1563. So that was the first edition. But what is of interest for us here is that this book by John Fox, the full title, you have it here, acts and monuments of these latter and perilous days touching matters of the church, also known as the Book of Martyrs. Everyone called it the Book of Martyrs. So Fox's Book of Martyrs. This book was re-edited in the 19th century, widely circulated, extremely successful, because obviously you had images and associated with text. It was also published in an abridged version, so you had shorter versions, and it was very popularly circulated. So what you have here, and this is also the image that I showed you with the title of my presentation, you have here a representation of a burning of martyrs. So we're discussing the burning of another martyr this morning, but those were English martyrs burnt in 1555. So that was another way to revive the memory of intolerance and persecution of the Catholics. And a third type of, reenacting and reviving the memory of Catholic violence and intolerance was, which actually they still exist today, but the form has not changed. I mean, the message has changed, not the form. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the parades of the 12th of July. They're extremely popular, especially in Canada and in Ulster and in Scotland. And also you have some in Australia. So what were those 12th of July parades? They were initiated by the Orange Order. So the Orange Order was founded in the late 18th century in Ulster in Northern Ireland, at a time where there was a war between Catholics and Protestants. So the ribbon men were the Catholics and the orange men were the opposing Protestant order. It was it was known, as the Orange Order. The orange was a reference to William of Orange, the king that was brought to Britain after the Glorious Revolution, the Protestant king. And the Orange Order was a brotherhood, and mainly its participants were working class. So it was a brotherhood, a mutual benefit society, and also it had a strong political and religious stance. And every 12th of July, there would be a great, and still are, great parades organized, where you would see Orangemen in their regalia with their orange costume, etc., with banners. And those parades commemorated, Javier mentioned it in his introduction, the victory of William of Orange on the Battle of the Boyne against the troops of the Pope, etc., etc. So it was a big Protestant victory against the Catholic forces, and especially the Vatican. And what you have here is taken from, so you have an image with where you have typical symbols. You have William of Orange at the bottom of the picture. These are typical symbols associated with the Orange Order, which had a Masonic dimension. And the small excerpt that you have here is taken from a booklet of the Orange Order, so the Canadian Orange Order. The question asked is, why do the Orangemen perpetuate the 12th of July, and do I have, this is a question of an Orange member, do I have to parade? And the answer is, they perpetuate a memorable epoch in the history of our country, which gave to all Protestants and Romanists alike civil and religious liberty. So apparently those parades are for religious toleration and liberty. But when you look at 19th century parades, often they ended in extreme Protestant and Catholic violence, and they were quite violent, especially in Scotland and in Ulster. So that's also interesting, the way that they present their own way of working. Okay, so I just wanted in this first part to briefly present the various ways in which the memories of Catholic intolerance and Catholic violence were reactivated by anti-Catholic societies in the 19th century in Britain and in the colonies. The second point that I'd like to make is the use of history. And this morning we also had elements both in Valentina and Evelyn's presentations, So my second question will be, how was history instrumentalized by the anti-Catholic society? So ultra-Protestants or anti-Catholic societies were very keen to use official history books in order to promote their vision of history. But they were also, so not only did they reactivate memories, but they also stated that they could also use serious objective history. So I've joined here a list of the books which were recommended by the Protestant Observer. The Protestant Observer was the periodical which was edited by the Imperial Protestant Federation, which I told you about earlier. And it's interesting because you have a mixture of militant history books and more objective, serious history books here. You see that first Fox's Acts and Monuments are quoted. So this was more of a militant anti-Catholic kind of book. But you have also, it's interesting, you have a translation from Merle d'Aubigné, from a French Reformation historian. And other than that, you have the book by James Anthony Froude, who was an Oxbridge, I can't remember if it was Cambridge or it was an Oxbridge professor in the 19th century, and his history of England from the fall of Wolsey to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So there's an interesting, combination here of militant history and also more objective forms of history. So I want to just spend a few minutes on this and to explain in more global terms what kind of history, what type of history were those anti-Catholics promoting in Britain. So what was very interesting, and you'll find this in all presentations of history by those anti-Catholic clubs, what was interesting is that they all had the same perspective, which was that since the Reformation, God's plan for the chosen British, the British as elect people, included a moral vigor, religious fervor, yes, imperial expansion, and economic prosperity. And this was God's plan for Britain and the colonies. And this was their reading of history ever since the Reformation. So what is interesting is that if you take this vision of history, you can see that every time that the state would concede toleration for Catholics in this vision of history, every time that there would be state intervention in favor of toleration, this meant that the British and their imperial brethren were going backwards. So every step forward in terms of toleration was translated by them as a step backwards in terms of progress and modernity. They conveyed the impression that every act of toleration was a step back to dark pre-Reformation times. So this was their very simple presentation of history. And I'd like to emphasize this. I'll show you one or two quotes. Sorry. And this is a quote taken from a pamphlet written and published by the Scottish Reformation Society. Now, this Scottish Reformation Society still exists today. It's still alive, but this quote is taken from 1900, and of course they have toned down. They don't speak like this today anymore, not officially. So I'll read it out with you. I mean that it is our Bible and our Protestant faith which have made Britain great amongst the nations. Considering our original condition, our poor thin soil, and our cold, inhospitable climate, and the mist of the Atlantic wrapping this poor little island for most of the year, it is a wonder that we were ever heard of. But God, in his providence, sent us the Bible, and we became great and brave and free as we inhaled his spirit, till Britain stands now among the first. So I chose this quote because of now. Spain and other countries, in obedience to the Pope, tried to crush our liberty and to deprive us of the word of life, and they went backward till now. They are of no consequence in the life of Europe. If we renounce our Protestant faith and adopt the superstition of the Middle Ages, we shall throw away our crown and become the laughing stock of all the nations of the globe. So what's interesting here is that when you go through those visions of history, Spain is obviously always, Spain and France are the top two taken as examples of Catholic backwardness. And Italy too, but not so much, because then you have Garibaldi in the 1860s, so it's a little more complex. So what is interesting is that to feed this simplistic vision of history, the ultra-Protestant societies also felt that they were supported by official historians. And this is a quote taken from Thomas Babington Macaulay. So I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's considered as one of the great Whig, so liberal historians, British historians of the 19th century. He died in the late 1840s. And his History of England is considered as very representative of this this trend of Whig or liberal history. So I'll very briefly, and they were eager, so they took excerpts from Macaulay, for instance, and then they inserted those quotes in their various publications. So they often refer to this one: whoever passes in Germany from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant principality, in Switzerland, in Ireland, etc. So the end of the quote: the Roman Catholics of Lower Canada remain inert, while the whole continent round them is in a ferment with Protestant activity and enterprise. So again, this differentiation between Protestant modernity and Catholic laziness, backwardness, superstition, etc. All right, let's get this. So my third and final point, after briefly reviewing with you the use of memories, the use of official and unofficial history in anti-Catholic discourse, I want to ask the 1,000 pesetas question, 1 million. What were the effects of those hate speeches on policies of state toleration? Because in the end, as historians, we are also, and probably when I started working on the subject, I thought that I would, find more effects of those anti-Catholic societies. And then I realized that, I'll go back in conclusion, that it wasn't about effects, it was more about symptomatic symptoms. Okay, so very briefly, if you're, for those who are not necessarily very familiar with British history, if you look at, I've just given you some important dates of the 19th century, with the first one, which is the most important in terms for Catholics, 1829. A law was passed, and it's been nicknamed Catholic Emancipation. This was the political emancipation of Catholics in Britain, because after 1829 they were able to sit in Parliament, which they hadn't been able to do so far. So this was the Magna Carta for Catholics in 19th century Britain, this Catholic emancipation. 1850, you had the re-establishment of the Catholic hierarchy in England, very important. Ever since the Reformation, Britain had been a land of mission for the Catholic Church. But in 1850, the Pope and the Catholic hierarchy reimposed the bishoprics, etc. There was a vague protest from the British Parliament, but nothing stopped this. And you have a similar re-establishment in 1878 in Scotland. And I'd like to study with you, and this will be my final point in this third part. I'd like to study with you this last date, 1910, the modification of the coronation oath, because it's an interesting case study in the effect, or probably the non-effect, of anti-Catholic discourse in Britain. So what am I talking about? This accession declaration oath is the oath that the new monarch, a king or a queen, ever since the early 18th century, this is the sermon, the oath that they would pronounce in front of the Parliament. And this was the version that hadn't been changed ever since 1700. So I'm just going to read it very briefly with you, or just insist on the notions that, the words and the expressions that I've underlined. There is not any transubstantiation, so a rejection of the Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist. And then you can also see at the end of the oath, and the sacrifice of the Mass, as they are now used in the Church of Rome, are superstitious and idolatrous. And this was the sermon that the king had to pronounce in front of Parliament. So what happened was, Queen Victoria had a very long reign, and when she died, her son Edward in 1901 became king, and he had to read this in front of Parliament. So what's very interesting is that witnesses around him said that when he read this out loud, he really mumbled, and he spoke in a very low tone, and there was a lot of embarrassment, because in 1900, having to say this felt much less comfortable than in the early 19th century. So this is very interesting, because after this reading, after this sermon was taken by the king in 1901, there started a campaign in Parliament and outside of Parliament too, in support for the modification of the wording of the Declaration Oath, because obviously the king had so many millions of Catholic subjects in Ireland, but also in Canada and Australia, etc. So of course it was very offensive to the Catholic subjects of the British monarch. So it's very interesting, because this resulted in public discourses, new articles in the press, and a campaign in favor of the modification. Now, how did our anti-Catholic societies, obviously they were obsessed with the fact that the wording should remain the same, because they said, and I'm just going to show you two pamphlets here. You have one by Walter Walsh, whom I mentioned earlier, the founder of the Imperial Protestant Federation. So in 1901, he immediately published a defense of the King's Protestant Declaration. Okay, and this was widely circulated. And also the Church Association, which was a member of the Imperial Protestant Federation, presented petitions to the House of Commons with over 600,000 signatures from Britain and from the colonies. So the anti-Catholic societies were very virulent. They were very active in promoting the fact that this shouldn't be changed. And probably in the 1900s, their campaign was in some part successful, probably some part. But nevertheless, less than 10 years later, I've gone backwards, sorry. When King George was crowned and he had to pronounce the oath was modified by a law in 1910. And it's interesting to see that all references in the new sermon, you have no reference to the Catholic doctrine. You don't have the word papist or Catholic or Mass, which is used. You just have a very broad Protestant affirmation of the Protestant nature of the monarchy. So this is very interesting. In a decade, all references, all anti-papist, anti-Catholic references had been taken away. So in the end, the anti-Catholics weren't successful in having the old version maintained. Final example of the non-effectiveness of anti-Catholic virulent campaign, the passing in 1926 of a Roman Catholic relief bill. So what is interesting is that almost 100 years after the 1829 Catholic Emancipation Act, this relief, so this new law, this bill, went further in extending certain rights to Catholics. Of course, a certain number of offices were still prohibited for Catholics. It's interesting because it's the last change to these the last change to the law of 1829 were taken in 2013. So ever since 2013, with a modification to the succession to the crown, a British monarch now is allowed to marry a Catholic. So only obviously a British monarch can't be a Catholic because he or she is the head of the Anglican Church, but you can marry a Catholic, but only 2013. It only happened there. Okay, so a few words to conclude. So as I've tried to show you in a very brief and large, with a broad picture, is that memories of religious intolerance, of Catholic religious intolerance, and the history of Catholic so-called wrongdoings, everything that the Catholics have done wrong. So those memories were mobilized in religious hate discourses in Britain in the later part of the 19th century. And this goes back to what Valentine Zuber was saying this morning, when she articulated intolerance and tolerance. The strategy of the anti-Catholic associations, their strategy, was to prove that tolerance did not work with intolerant people. Okay, you could be tolerant with everyone, but not with the intolerant ones. And the intolerant ones here were the Catholics because of their past history. So that was the first point that they made. Second point, clearly, if you look at the history of the long 19th century, up until the 1930s, from the early 19th century up until the 1930s, because as 19th century historians now we have to extend to go into the 20th century, ultra-Protestant societies and clubs were in the end not successful in terms of fighting against growing state toleration towards Catholics in Britain. So their history was not a history of success, clearly. They went against a tide, a wave of state toleration, which was far stronger than their mobilization, their discourses, their physical demonstrations, etc. This is the general picture that you can get if you take things in a longer time period. So my final question is, did their speeches, did their actions generate anything else than practical results? Because in terms of practical results, they weren't very convincing. Well, if you take a close look at the history of those ultra-Protestant societies within a wider British and colonial framework, clearly their success lay elsewhere. It was somewhere else that they were successful, because they contributed to an idealized Britishness. Where they were successful was that they had something to offer in terms of building a national identity. And I think that some of our colleagues here are going to be discussing this for other parts of Europe this afternoon and tomorrow. So what is interesting is that in the end, their utterances, their cries, appealed to people, and I'm taking this quote from the historian John Maiden, who is a specialist of Anglican, 20th century Anglican history. So they did encounter success in terms of an imagined community, imagined Protestant nation and community, for people, I quote, nurtured on stories of Marian martyrs. We saw that earlier. The Armada, well, I didn't want to mention it too much. And the gunpowder plot, this goes back to what Javier said in his introduction, and the Protestant wind of 1688, meaning the Glorious Revolution. So clearly their idealized Britishness was built on this, and it was built on the idea that you could only be truly British if you were a Protestant, and that there was no space in a sense for Catholics. And obviously I haven't mentioned it here because I mean, it's a whole other subject. Obviously this has to do with the history of Ireland. And even today with Brexit and everything, you know that it's complicated in Northern Ireland. So obviously the history of Catholic Ireland has to do with this fabrication, this this imagining of British identities. So thank you very much.
Merci. Great. So working. So that's yours, but it doesn't work.
doesn't work. Good.
Good start for you. Close window. It was this one.
Yeah. It's a power